Hello, welcome to this channel. Today we are going to talk about transport across the cell membrane. As we know that the cell needs to transport materials such as nutrients, water, and electrolytes, and also get rid of many unwanted substances like waste materials and carbon dioxide. And this is done by transporting materials across the cell membrane. The cell membrane is well suited for the transport of substances in and out of the cell, and this cell membrane has lipids and proteins which help in the transport of the various substances between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. Basically, there are two mechanisms or two types of transport across the cell membrane, and these are the passive transport mechanism and the active transport mechanism. Today, we shall be talking about the passive transport. Passive transport is the transport of substances along the concentration gradient and the electrical gradient, or both the electrochemical gradient. It's also known as diffusion or the downhill movement. It does not need energy. It's just like swimming in the direction of water flow in a river. Here the substances move from the region of high concentration to the region of low concentration. Diffusion is of two types, namely simple diffusion and then the facilitated diffusion. And the simple diffusion can be either through the lipid layer or the protein layer. And the facilitated diffusion can be also called the carrier-mediated diffusion. Talking about the simple diffusion through the protein layer, we know that the lipid layer of the cell membrane is permeable only to the lipid-soluble substances, and these are oxygen, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. And diffusion through the lipid layer is directly proportional to the solubility of these substances in the lipids. The simple diffusion through the protein layer passes through the proteins of the cell membrane that are permeable to only water-soluble substances, and mainly of these are these electrolytes. The protein channels that are in the cell membrane are throughout the central lipid layer of the cell membrane. There are pores which are made by the integral protein molecules of the protein layer. These pores are present and lined up by the integral proteins. These pores are the hypothetical pores and form the channels for the diffusion of water, electrolytes, and other substances which cannot pass through the lipid layer. As the channels are lined by the protein molecules, these are called the protein channels for water-soluble substances. The characteristic feature of these protein channels is the selective permeability. That is, each channel can permit only one type of ion to pass through it, and these channels are named after the ions that diffuse through them, such as the sodium channels, potassium channels, and many others. These are also regulated by continuously being opened or most of the channels being closed. So we can classify the channels also as ungated channels or the gated channels. The ungated channels are those that are continuously opened, while the gated channels are those that are closed. The gated channels can also further be classified into three types. That's the voltage-gated channels, the ligand-gated channels, or the mechanically gated channels. The voltage-gated channels are those that open whenever there is a change in the electrical potential. For example, in the neuromuscular junction, when the action potential reaches the axon terminal, the calcium channels are opened and calcium ion diffuse into the interior of the axon terminal from the extracellular fluid. While the ligand-gated channels are those that open when there is presence of some mechanical or when there is presence of some hormonal substances. The hormonal substances are the ones that we regard to as ligands, and the channels are called the ligand-gated channels. The example we can give here is the transmission of an impulse through the neuromuscular junction, where the acetylcholine is released from the vesicles. Acetylcholine moves through the presynaptic membrane and reaches the synaptic cleft. When the acetylcholine reaches the synaptic cleft, they cause opening of the sodium channels in the postsynaptic membrane and the sodium ions diffuse into the neuromuscular junction from the extracellular fluid. The third is the mechanically gated channels, and these are the channels which are opened by some mechanical factors. They are present in pressure receptors and the receptor cells of the organ of Corti and the vestibular apparatus. Having looked at the simple diffusion, we go to the next, which is the facilitated or the carrier-mediated diffusion. Facilitated or the carrier-mediated diffusion is a type of diffusion by which the water-soluble substances having larger molecules are transported through the cell membrane with the help of a carrier protein. By this process, the substances are transported across the cell membrane faster than the transport by simple diffusion. Glucose and amino acids are transported by this type of diffusion. Glucose and amino acids cannot diffuse through the channels because the diameter of these molecules are larger than the diameter of the channels. Molecules of this substance bind with a carrier protein. Some conformation change occurs in the carrier protein. Due to this change, the molecules reach to the other side of the cell membrane. The factors that affect the rate of diffusion overall are listed. One is the rate of diffusion is directly proportional to the permeability of the cell membrane. Since the cell membrane is selectively permeable, only a limited number of substances can diffuse through the membrane. The second is that the rate of diffusion is directly proportional to the body temperature. Increase in the temperature increases the rate of diffusion. This is because the thermal motion of molecules This is because of the increased thermal motion of the molecules when the temperature rises. The third is that the rate of diffusion is directly proportional to the concentration gradient or the electrical gradient of the diffusing substances. The diffusion rate is also directly proportional to the solubility of the substances, particularly the lipid-soluble substances. Since oxygen is highly soluble in lipid, diffuses very rapidly through the lipid layer. Then, the rate of diffusion is inversely proportional to the thickness of the cell membrane. If the cell membrane is thick, the diffusion of substances is very slow. The rate of diffusion is also inversely proportional to the size of these molecules. Thus, the substances with smaller molecules diffuse rapidly than the substances with larger molecules. Generally, the rate of diffusion is inversely proportional to the size of the ions. Smaller ions can pass through the membrane more easily than larger ions with the same charge. However, it is not applicable always. For instance, sodium ions are smaller in size than potassium ions. Still, sodium ions cannot pass through the membrane as easily as potassium ions because sodium ions have got the tendency to gather water molecules around them. This makes it difficult for sodium ions to diffuse through the membrane. Lastly, the rate of diffusion is inversely proportional to the charge of the ions. The greater the charge of the ions, the lesser the rate of diffusion. For example, diffusion of